Welcome back to a new chapter at Economics Design. Today we're going to talk about something different. Today we're going to talk about cross-chain DEX. We talked about DEXes before, decentralized exchange. We talk about them on a specific chain, so usually built on Ethereum. You have stuff like Uniswap, you have stuff like Balancer, you have stuff like Curve. So they're exchanging between ERC20 assets. We also talked about a different kind called Bancor, and they do different kind of crypto assets. So it could be ERC20, it could be on EOS, it could be on Tron. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to look at cross-chain DEX. So it has a different component, an additional set of players and participants to think about, and we will dive deep into that. So this specific project is called Sifchain, and before I start, I want to give a disclaimer that this is in collaboration with block.science and Sifchain. How do I go next? Yes. And block.science helped a lot in the discussion and helped me to understand what they're doing. And then this project is planned to be launched in mid-January. Once again, this is not investment advice. Everything is just purely educational. So today we'll cover 5 main things. The first one is what is cross-chain AMM, or what's cross-chain DEX? How is it different from the usual DEX that we are comfortable with and we talked a lot about? Then we're going to do a bit of a whiteboard session. So we're going to talk a little bit about the big picture understanding of what Sifchain is about. How do we look at validators, liquidity providers, different traders? Then we're going to see the economics behind all these different mechanisms. We're going to come back and talk about the economics of the token itself. And lastly, we're going to run through some FAQs that you probably ask. So let's get started with cross-chain versus the usual AMM that we're comfortable with. As I mentioned, in AMMs or in DEXes, they're primarily we're always talking about a typical AMM. So that is built on a specific layer 1. So you don't have to think about how do I deal with validators to validate these transactions, because that is done by someone else. It's a different protocol, it's a different set of people, it's a different company, different project, different open source smart contract. They're all layer 1. So that's being done over there. And for typical AMMs, they're just building a platform to transact between the crypto assets. So for example, on Uniswap, you can transact between Ethereum or Ether and Rep NXM, Rep BTC, Run BTC, SBTC, SETH. There are all these different assets available. There's ERC20 that you could trade and swap around with. So that's your typical AMMs that we are comfortable with and we've talked a lot about. You can go up and check more. I'll link them to figure out what am I talking about. I think it was episode 19 that discuss a little bit further into that. Then we have another type where I think it's 2 episodes ago where we went to deep dive into Bancor. And Bancor, it's different because it's similar to Uniswap, so it allows you to trade between assets. And it expands a little bit further because you can also trade non-ERC20 assets. So it could be assets that is listed on EOS or in Tron, something else. So if you think about it, think of each layer 1 as a country. So in Ethereum, everything is built in the US, so only US stocks are being traded over there. Bancor is where you can trade stocks that is from the UK, you live in the US, and you can trade with the UK stocks. So that's the rough idea. And lastly, we have this thing called, which is also cross-chain, but slightly different. That's what I want to talk about today. And it adds in a layer 1 solution. So it has its own layer 1 solution where it will validate each of these transactions as well. There are a lot of pros and cons to that. Pros generally being it's probably a lot faster, it's a lot cheaper, and you can control a bit more of the different behaviors and different incentives to affect the different kind of behaviors that you want to have in your ecosystem. Because you can control or you can incentivize actions in the validators layer and the liquidity provider layer, so the application layer. So the cons is that, because you have 2 focuses now, it's important to balance them. And balancing will be one of the big things that we're talking about in this episode. So we're going to, the main difference between this Sifchain, which also includes its own layer 1, is that it will consider validation, it will consider incentives, and it will consider stuff like block rewards that you're comfortable with in Bitcoin. So let's go and chat a little about comparing the technology of Sifchain with Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is something that we're all comfortable with. So if we I want to show you the comparison of Sifchain with Bitcoin, because that is quite a similar idea. So blockchain is really blocks, and then you line them up in a chain. It can't be more straightforward than that. So let's say this is Bitcoin, right? And so you have block 1, block 2, and block 3. Within each block, you have to validate. What do you validate? You validate your transactions. So these transactions is where all your, since Bitcoin is all about P2P payment, you have P2P payment between person A and person B. So every time it's done, these are transactions that we validated, to be input into the block, and then it will be minting the next block. So this is where validators exist. And in Bitcoin, how do we create Bitcoin? Bitcoin is created when every block is validated, you will issue Bitcoins. Now is 6.25 Bitcoins. About 6 months ago, it was 12.5 Bitcoins, or I don't know, one of them. And then a few years ago, it was 25 Bitcoins and then 50 Bitcoins. So every 4 years, it halves, right? I'm sure you already know this. So every time a validator, this only one person validates, yeah? One winner. He validates this block and he gets, I think right now it's 12.5 blocks, 12.5 Bitcoins. So he gets 12.5 Bitcoins. So this exists, and this is how Bitcoin is being minted. It's extra Bitcoin is coming into the system. So it mints and validates each of these blocks, and then it gets these transactions. So this is what we call layer 1. So it's really the foundational layer. The foundational layer that checks what's going on, that validates all the different transactions that's going on. Now, what happens on top of layer 1? Okay, we call this the debt layer, so the application layer, so the decentralized application layer. And this is what I meant by your P2P payment, P2P transaction. So if you pay me in Bitcoins, which if you want, I'm always happy to give you my address. So let's say you give me 1 Bitcoin to this company, or to this company. Okay, so this person gives 1 Bitcoin to a company, and this is on the application layer. And so all these little details will go into this block and be validated. So that's in general how Bitcoin works, right? It's your layer 1 and then your application. Now let's go back to Sifchain. So Sifchain, as you can imagine, is also quite similar. It has your layer 1 solution, and then it has your little box to be validated. So if we go back to the layer 1 again, you have block 1, block 2, block 3 that will be validated. So block 1 is when you have all these different transactions, and then you also have validators that will be getting your tokens, and their tokens is called ROWAN. ROWAN. So they will also be getting the ROWAN tokens. And these ROWAN tokens are basically your block rewards. And the key difference, which we will go into a bit later, is that in Bitcoin, your block rewards is fixed. It only changes every 4 years. But here, the block rewards changes every single time a transaction occurs, because it's dynamic, it's dynamically increasing, and it's dynamically calculated. So the rewards, the block rewards for every block that's minted by validators, they change. And so if layer 1 is the validators, which is same as Bitcoin, then what about the debt layers? In Bitcoin, the debt layer was P2P payment, right? So I'm paying you, you're paying me, and that kind of currency payment. In the debt layer for ROWAN, the thing is exchanges. Exchange or swap. That means if I have 1 Lisa token and I have 1 ROWAN token, and during block 1, I trade 10 Lisa tokens for 10 ROWAN tokens, and someone else trades 8 ROWAN tokens for 8 Lisa tokens, and whatever. And all these different exchanges are going to be added into this block, which will be validated by your validators, and they will get ROWAN tokens in return. So this is the general idea. This is the main difference. So now that we have that out of the way, now that we understand what is the main difference between this cross-chain application, your cross-chain decentralized exchange, then let's dive a little bit deeper to understand what are the mechanisms and economics behind Sifchain, because it's quite interesting and different. You don't see this in the market yet. So that's why I want to talk about it. So if you can see this little drawing that I have over here, as you can imagine, we have two different layers, right? The first layer is your layer 1, which is your validators. As you can see, this happy person over here. And then you have the other layer, which is your liquidity providers, which is the other happy person over here. And now, I mentioned that rebalancing is going to be very important in this aspect. Why? Because we have to balance between the validators and liquidity providers in this ecosystem. In all the other examples, Uniswap, in Curve, in Balancer, in Bancor, you're just going to focus on liquidity providers. You're going to figure out what is the rewards to give them. You're going to figure out the math behind the exchange. You don't have to figure out the validation because it's done by someone else. So this is where Sifchain is different. So what we want to balance now is to balance validators and liquidity providers. Why? Because people have to make decisions. So if I have some ROWAN, for example. This is me. And I have some ROWAN tokens. Now, I can make a decision. If I have ROWAN tokens, I can make 3 types of decisions. 1, I can be a validator. 2, I can decide to be a liquidity provider. Or 3, I can just be a trader. So I use the ROWAN token to trade for something else. So these are the 3 different functions that I could hold and I could be. To be a validator, it's the same thing as to be your BTC miner. Because you're validating transactions, you're a miner. You're mining for additional tokens. So if you're a validator, you're basically like a BTC miner. If you're a liquidity provider, then it's same as your different LP tokens on Uniswap, on Balancer, on Curve. So if you're a liquidity provider, then it's the same as the same concept of liquidity provider in other projects. And lastly, if you're a trader, then it's the same thing. You're a trader, which means you exchange tokens. You exchange tokens between different kind of tokens. So you could be a user on Binance, on Huobi, on KuCoin, on Uniswap, Balancer, Curve, Bancor, whatever. So me as a ROWAN token holder, I have to decide between these 3. And how do people make decisions? This is where economics comes in, right? All the opportunity cost. So if I'm a trader, so there are three different functions that we could be. We could be a trader. So if I'm a trader, it means that I want the price right now. If ROWAN costs 1 ETH, I want the price of 1 ETH right now. If ROWAN costs 0.5 ETH, I want 0.5 ETH right now. So that's how you become a trader. If you are a liquidity provider, it means that I want to put up my liquidity into the pool so people can exchange. And what can I do with that? I can be earning additional money. I can be earning additional tokens by being a liquidity provider because I'm earning the fees. So this is something like I put money in the bank and I earn interest rates, right? And lastly, you have validators. So it's also a similar concept. I put money in the bank and then I get different kind of interest rates. And this interest rates is basically your block rewards. So in general, we want to focus more on validator and liquidity provider, mainly because you get returns on that. And when you get returns on that, people like it. When people like it, people want to put more money in there. Because if you're a trader, yeah, you get money right now. But if there's potential that you're going to get a lot more money in the future, then you usually want to use the other systems instead. So in this episode, we want to focus more on validators and liquidity providers. So going back to the drawing board, what we have over here, so now as me, I will make a decision. I don't care about traders. So let's say I really believe in the system and I want to earn more money based on the current ROWAN tokens that I have. So I'll either be a validator or liquidity provider. So this is a decision that I have to make. And in economics, it's about decision. It's about making decisions, right? So making decisions are your behaviors. We want to understand how do people behave and what can we do to affect this behavior. And this is where rewards come in. Yes, we all like rewards, right? Rewards are basically incentives, and this is very good. So you want to decide between being a validator or liquidity provider. Well, there's nothing that's free in the world. You can't just get rewards by not doing anything. We do something by staking. So if you are a validator, you have to stake tokens. And if you're a liquidity provider, you have to provide liquidity, which is a different kind of staking. So this is the decision you make. Do I stake or do I provide liquidity? Now, how do we decide? Other than all the different risks that you're considering, one of the ways to decide is in a very objective way is to look at incentives, which are your rewards. And now the system has two forms of rewards. You have rewards to liquidity providers and rewards to validators. So if you think about it, you have a big bowl of rewards or presents because it's Christmas time. And then you can either put all the rewards inside here, so you can be total rewards, and then you allocate it every time someone does something good. So every time a validator does something good, you give rewards to validator. If every time a liquidity provider does something good, you give rewards to liquidity providers from this reward pool. In general, yes, you can do that. You can combine them together. But if you look deeper into the whole mechanism that we'll talk about a bit later, what you want to do is that instead of one big box, you cut it into half. So half is for liquidity providers, one is for validators. So all the rewards inside here will only be given to liquidity providers, and all the rewards inside here will only be given to validators because they're separate. Why are they separate? Because they exist on two different ecosystems. They're two very separate things that we want to encourage, the two very different behaviors, two very different outcomes to the behaviors. And that is why we have to separate their rewards into two big segments, into two separate segments. Okay, so now that we have two different segments, how will the rewards be affecting validators? The first part to validator is either the mint or burn. So as you can imagine, this is something like, the proof of stake thing in Ethereum. If you don't know what it is, it's that you stake your tokens and then you will get rewarded based on your stake. And if you are a bad actor, so if you validate some bad transactions, then your stakes will be burnt. Okay, so that's it. When it's burnt, the tokens just disappear. It'll be gone. You can't touch it anymore. Nobody in the ecosystem, nobody in the world can touch it. If you mint it, that's where you have additional tokens. That is the block rewards that we talked about. Something like the Bitcoin that we talked about, block rewards. Okay, and what about liquidity providers? Liquidity providers comes from few ways. The first one is fees. So as you can imagine, every time you make transactions, you have to pay a small amount of fees. So this fees is calculated, and this fees go to the liquidity providers. And it also depends on how frequent the volume is, because that affects the total amount that is given to liquidity providers. And lastly, it's also subsidy. So subsidy it's if you want to call it, you can call it yield mining, yield farming, liquidity mining, liquidity or yield mining, yield farming. So this is subsidy, which is where your rewards, you actually put some rewards in here where the system also rewards liquidity providers. Right? Okay, so when we look at fees and volume, so the thing in the top half of this line, this is by users. So users, traders that we talked about just now, every time they transact, then they will also give some fees to liquidity providers. The main difference with subsidy, as you can imagine, subsidy is given out by the protocol itself, the system itself. So this is to the liquidity providers, it's the same thing. It's money given to me. But from a back-end point of view, it's different because fees comes from traders, subsidy comes from the system. So why do I want to talk about this? The fact is that at the end of the day, we need to balance this. We need to balance between these two different circles. Because once again, if we have a big circle of total rewards, we can we want it to be 50% to validators and 50% to liquidity providers. Why? This is very important to keep balancing this because as I mentioned, it all goes back to the fundamental question. Me as an individual over here, I want to decide either staking or to provide liquidity. And the only reason I'm going to decide one of them is based on my returns that I get, right? Your ROI. So your ROI is really based on your rewards. And so if the rewards is higher in validators, then everyone will go and be a validator, and there'll be no one being liquidity providers. If there's no one being liquidity providers, there's no traders going to be trading, and there's nothing to be validated. And if there are too many liquidity providers, or too much rewards to liquidity providers, everyone wants to be a liquidity provider, and there wouldn't be enough people to be validating these transactions. So it's not a very good system then. So how do we make sure that this system is good? By rebalancing, by balancing validators and liquidity providers. So in this whiteboard session, we're going to talk about three things. The first one is validator. We want to dive a little bit deeper into understanding the validator system. Then I also want to talk about liquidity providers. So there are two ways liquidity can be provided. You can do it in symmetric, and then you can do it in asymmetric. So that these have different formulas, these have different mechanisms behind them, and so I do want to talk about them. So we're going to start with validator system on this side, then we're going to move on to liquidity providers. So let's get started with the validator system. In the validator system, it is pretty straightforward because, so we have the total supply. So the total supply of tokens. And as I mentioned before, there are two ways we can do with just the total supply alone. We can either mint or burn. So mint is where we have additional block rewards, so a plus over here, or a minus where you burn. Burn if you're a bad actor. So this will affect the total supply. And so your minting is basically a block rewards every time a Bitcoin is validated, you get additional block rewards. So how do we split the total supply though? The total supply is split into two different things. One is staked by validators, and one is circulating supply. As you can imagine, so in validators, staked by validators, this is stuck in your layer one. And in the circulating supply, this is basically in your DEX, which is your application layer. So there are two different layers. Now, in the staked by validators, we call them V, small v, and then in the circulating supply, we call them C, small c. And in the circulating supply, we can use them in two other ways. The first one is to be used by liquidity providers, and the second is other on-chain activities. So to be a liquidity provider, you have to stake your ROWAN tokens to have liquidity, right? Because every time we talk about decentralized exchange, we talk about autonomous market maker, you're basically trading with the reserve, and this is part of the reserve. The other on-chain activities will be probably governance, different kind of voting, or you basically just trading or peer-to-peer exchange, paying in ROWAN tokens. So these are the two different kind of systems that we're talking about. Now, we want to dive a little bit deeper into understanding what are the different parameters that will affect the validator system. And the reason why I'm talking a little bit more on the validator side is because, number one, I have not talked about layer one in the entire podcast series yet, so I want to show you a little bit more about layer one. And the second thing is that all the application layer is pretty much similar in concept, so I don't want to go and repeat the same thing all over again because you probably already have understood what it is. Okay, so when we talk about validator system, there are two main things that we are discussing. We're discussing I and we're discussing A. So as you can imagine, I is your inflation. And this A is your accumulated block rewards. So it's your total block rewards. So if you think about it, they're pretty much the same thing. Inflation is the additional of new assets that's entering the system, and A is the total number of assets that is introduced into the system per year. The main difference is that inflation is in percentage and A is in whole numbers. Okay, per block. And A is whole numbers and total amount. So this is the main difference. And this is your inflation is your amount per blocks, and this is your total block rewards over a period of year, over an entire year. So, the thing about inflation is that, as you can imagine, inflation is the amount of new tokens being introduced into the system. Now you have to balance this as well. This is another balance that we have to talk about. And there is minimum and maximum inflation. So let's say this is time. So there's a minimum and maximum inflation that's fixed. And in general, you can fix this in the smart contract. And so every time inflation is recalculated, because this is dynamic, it calculates all the time, it has to be within this threshold, within this max and min bar. And so these are constraints that we have included in the system. And what does that remind you of? Remember we talked about Amperforce, which I'll also link out. Amperforce was an algorithmically rebalancing stable token or pegged to USD, soft pegged to USD, with this upper and lower bound of 5%. So it's really the same concept. The thing about all these different economics and all these different episodes is that you have the same concept applied differently across all these different projects and protocols. How cool is that? So you just need to learn a few and then you realize you learned everything. Okay, so let's do a little bit of math for the inflation part. It won't be too complicated, I promise you. So as I mentioned, this is the rate, right? So this is the percentage rate. So let's look at the annualized rate. So the annualized rate, and let's look at the change in inflation. So we call this positive change I plus is 1 minus rho v over sigma v times I over beta. Okay, so what does this mean? And this is also within our range that we talked about, I mean and I max. Okay, so what is this formula? It's really not that complicated. Let's look at what it is. Okay, firstly, what is rho v and what's sigma v? So rho v and sigma v is, remember I told you that one of the cool things about the validator system is that it's not a fixed supply. It's that every time a block is being the block rewards, and every time it's being minted, the block rewards is dynamically calculated. So how do we calculate this dynamic calculation? It's a bit complicated to understand, right? You can't just say something is dynamic and suddenly it's dynamic. No, we can turn this dynamic thing, this word dynamic, into the language that mathematics can understand. And then when mathematics can understand, your code and your smart contract can also understand. Okay, so let's look at what this is. So when we look at rho v and then sigma v, so rho v is the actual percentage staked. Sigma is the ideal percentage staked. Okay, so remember I told you that there's this 66%. I don't write things here for nothing, okay? 66% is the ideal stake. So if we have 100 million tokens, I want 66 million to be staked by validators. And then the other percent doesn't matter. It will just exist somewhere else with other use cases. So this is something that we want to balance, 66%. And this is fixed. Okay, this is the only thing that's not dynamic. It could probably change in the governance layer after that, but it's okay. It's fixed for now, 66%. So this ideal percentage stake is 66%. And the actual percentage stake will be, your amount of V over your total, and this will be your whatever percent. So let's say this is less than 66%. And so that means this ratio Okay, so there's three situations where this ratio will be different, or there are only three states this ratio could be. So it could be less than 1, it could be equals to 1, it could be more than 1. So when it's equals to 1, that means goal reached. Why? Because the ratio between actual stake and ideal stake is the same. That means the actual stake will be 66%, which is exactly what we want, and so it's 1. So the change in inflation will be 0. There will be no additional rewards because it is really what we want, and then there'll be change after, and then people will behave and react accordingly, and then you can change after. But the change in inflation, so the additional inflation will be 0. So the inflation will be whatever it is before. Now, what happens when it is less than 1? Less than 1 means one, we want more validators. Why? Because it means that the actual amount staked is more than your ideal amount. It's less than your ideal amount staked. That means maybe I have 50% stake, of which I want 66%, and so this is less than 1, right? You can obviously see it's less than 1 because 50 is less than 66. So if this is less than 1, this entire thing will be positive, and so this and change in annualized interest rate or an annualized inflation rate will increase, and so you'll be minting new block rewards because you'll be increasing the inflation rate. And what happens when it is less than 1? It means we want less validators. What does it mean? It means that when it's more than 1, it means, let's say we have 100% in your row V, so 100% is completely staked, and 66% is what we want. So that means this is more than 1, obviously, because 100 is more than 66, and so we want less validators. How do we do that? We can't just tell people, hey, stop being a validator. People don't listen to instructions. People respond to incentives. This is what all economics is about. And so how do we do? So this is more than 1. So that means 1 minus something more than 1 is negative, right? It's a negative number. And so this entire thing will be less. So this entire equation will be a negative sign. And so we will reduce the rates. That means we will reduce the minting. We'll have less block rewards, or no block rewards. We'll reduce the previous inflation rates that we have. So this is in a situation when that happens. Whatever we talked about here, right? As you can imagine, this is your annualized inflation rate. This is your total block rewards. So this is from an annual perspective. Now, this is good for you to understand when you're making a decision whether you want to be a validator or liquidity provider. Now, what we're going to do next is to look at each individual block reward. Because I told you, block rewards are very important. It helps you to make a decision whether you want to be a validator or liquidity provider. And so we want to change this. We want to decide this. So block rewards only make sense if we look at these values as an individual block, not annual rates. So let's look at that. We have, so A is the total block, the total additional mint per year, right? So let's say you're going to mint 20 million, and A will be 20 million tokens. That's basically what A means. And then you have beta, which is your total blocks per year. Okay, so can you see where I'm getting at now? So beta is the total blocks per year that is defined by the system. You can't really change that, it's defined already. So what we want to do now is look at small b, which is A over beta. So what we want to do is small b is the rewards per block. Small b is the total additional mint per year divided by the total blocks per year, and you get block rewards per block. It's as simple as it is. Okay, so it's a very basic thing. It's just A divided by beta. And well, how do we get A? A is your additional mint. So A is really your inflation rate that we talked about, because inflation is a percentage, multiply by your supply. Right? Because inflation is a percentage multiplied by the supply, that is whatever that's out there in the total supply, and you get your tokens, the specific number, the whole number of tokens that be added into the system. So what does that mean? It means that B equals I times, let's call supply S, over beta. Okay? And what we want to do now, and okay, the specificity of the math, I will link it in the description box below. But what you get at the end of the day is this thing called V is really the validator, and dot is just multiplication. So it's, how do we get to a situation where this is term A, this is term, these two are the same terms, and then you have an additional thing behind. Okay, and this is where the fun stuff of this whole dynamic rebalancing happens. So let's jump a little bit into details. Now, what you can see over here is, where do we see this value? This value is, you see, is the amount staked, right? This is your actual staked by validators. And SV is your actual amount. So this is percentage. This is actual amount staked. No, this is not actual. This is ideal. Sorry. Ideal staked. So what we're trying to calculate over here is that the inflation rate multiplied by the ideal stake times the actual amount versus the inflation, this is a multiplication times the actual amount staked. And what do we get? So like the fraction that we have just now, we have three different scenarios. So we have, when something minus something, it could be smaller than 1, it could be equal 0, it could be bigger than 1. So equal 0 is that they're the same thing, right? If equal 0, it means that the ideal amount staked and the actual amount staked is the same. So again, we get goal reached. And that's a good thing, because this equals 0. So we don't have to change anything about the individual specific block that is minted. On the other hand, when it is less than 1, it means that it's less than 1. That means this thing, the front one, is smaller than this. So less than 1, it means that the actual stake is too much. Okay, so what happens when there are too many validators in the system? Then you want to reduce your individual block rewards. So less individual block rewards, and you want to disincentivize people from staking. On the other hand, let me use a different marker. On the other hand, when you have more than 1, so that means the first one is bigger than the second. It means that we want to have more people. We need more people as validators. So we want more validators if it's more than 1. So if it's more than 1, this entire thing becomes positive, and so we have more B. So that means when there isn't enough validators in the system will automatically rebalance to give out more block rewards per individual. So that is the gist of the validator system. I hope that makes sense. And now we're going to go on to the liquidity provider, which is a completely different sub-segment or different ecosystem from what we talked about before. the base case of symmetric addition is everything that you see in Uniswap and all the other AMMs out there. And it is, again, we have our liquidity pool. And I have two tokens. So I have my ROWAN token and I have my Lisa tokens. Symmetric addition means that I'm adding in ROWAN tokens and I am adding Lisa tokens. And what do we get? We get ROWAN tokens, Lisa tokens, and then additional new ROWAN tokens and new Lisa tokens. And you can see that these are both liquidity pools. And the cool thing is this, remember we talked about invariant long time ago in episode 19? I will link it up there. And invariant is basically invariant. Means something that is kept constant. So this is what invariant is. So what we have in invariant is in these different liquidity pools, you have your x times y equals k model. So it's really x 0.5 times y 0.5 equals k. I also have the video, I'll link it above. You want to go check out all the specific details, but that's a general idea. X times y equals k. And so when we increase them proportionally, because this is a proportional thing, then you will still get the same thing. Okay, you'll still this x plus y equals x times y equals k, x times y equals k, because they're proportional. So this is what symmetric addition is. Symmetric addition is really adding the same quantity into the liquidity pool. So that is the main thing that I want to talk about in symmetric addition. And I also want to talk a little bit about the fees, because the fees is quite interesting. I'm going to give you the big gist first. And when we talk about fees, these are your transaction fees. Transaction fees that is embedded within the system and not additional calculation after your transactions. What do I mean? I mean, if I have ROWAN tokens, I have Lisa tokens, I want to trade. If we have external fee, it could be something like a fixed fee of 0.03 ROWAN per transaction. Or we can have an internal fee where we embed the fees into transactions. So for external fees, that's in general what you get for a lot of these systems out there. So for example, Bancor, Uniswap, they have a fixed fee for every transaction. So it makes sense if you are a big trader, arbitrage trader, you trade a lot of fees, and then you're just paying a fixed fee of a small amount. Whereas internal fee, it depends on the size of your trade, it depends on the depth of the liquidity, and it benefits differently. So external fee, it's good for traders, especially big traders. And then our internal fee is good for liquidity providers. Okay, so this is the main big difference, your internal fee and your external fee. Now that we got that out of the way, let's look at how they decide to deal with this fee. Of course, nothing is so easy as in I'll tell you what the answer is, because the reality is that the fees is a spectrum. The fees is a spectrum. So we have our constant market maker spectrum, and so this would be like your Uniswap, where your fee is external fee, zero internal fee. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have CLP, continuous liquidity provider. I think that's what it's called, a liquidity provision. And this is, I think it's zero external fee. But you have yes internal fee. And example of this would be Thorchain. Someone asked me to do Thorchain like a long time ago. I will get back to that. It's just a lot of things on the list of episodes to make. Okay, so basically what Sifchain does is that this is the lower bound. So this is your lower bound. And this is your upper bound. So your fees will be somewhere in between this line. Do we know what the exact fee is? It really depends. And what does it depend on? Let's see. So I'll just show you what the formula is, because as always, I will link them in the description below for you to get more details of the specific math, because I filmed this and it took 1 hour, and I don't think anyone is going to sit through 1 hour. So I'm just going to summarize and refilm it. This is the third time I'm refilming, and summarize it instead. So I am going to show you what the formula is, and I'll explain the formula instead, because it makes more sense to explain it and give you the intuition of what they mean. Okay, so this is the fee, and Q is the quantity, R is ROWAN tokens, L is Lisa tokens. So we're exchanging and then we're paying ROWAN tokens. So we're basically changing ROWAN tokens to Lisa tokens, and this is a fee formula. And what I want to say is that if you go back to the episode that I have, I'll link it up as well. The episode that I have on how do you calculate impermanent loss. This is your Uniswap model. So this is your no internal fee. So this is your no internal fee model, in which it's basically the Uniswap model. So this Uniswap model is your no internal fee, and you're basically calculating the difference. So small q is the change in tokens that you receive, and you're basically figuring out how much Lisa tokens you get in exchange for ROWAN tokens that you put in. This is the internal no fee model, and this is your internal fee model. And the key difference over here is this thing, right? If we have if they're equal, so if we make this equal, then we will just go to a full no internal fee model. And we also add some parameter over here so that you can have more form of customization, more variables to play around with to affect the fees payable. And you can, so this variable over here, we can have it in 3 different scenarios as well. Equals 0, equals 1, more than 1. So if it's 0, so this can be whatever it is. It is dependent on this parameter, and this parameter can be 0, and it means that we use the no fee model, and that means we use the Uniswap model. If it equals to 1, that is we use the yes internal fee model, and if it's more than 1, we have huge fee. And these fees are bad for traders but good for liquidity providers, because one of the biggest things that, as I also talked about in the Banco episode, is that liquidity providers are usually at a huge risk, at a huge vulnerability when there's a huge arbitrage going on. So for example, if a trader knows that there's a huge arbitrage opportunity coming up, they're going to be making huge trades, and usually this goes to the detriment of the liquidity provider, because they are the ones suffering the loss. It is a zero-sum game in this scenario. So how do we prevent that? We prevent that by giving a big fee, so increasing this parameter to be a huge one, so that this fees, it goes back to liquidity providers and arbitrage traders. I mean, they're earning anyway, so they're actually sharing the profit back to liquidity providers who exist in a good way to allow this opportunity to be given to arbitrage traders. Does that make sense? It basically, this huge fee is just profit sharing for arbitrage traders. That's it. So that's the general scenario, and that's what I want to talk about, because the symmetric edition is the same everywhere. I've had 2 long episodes talking about AMMs. I think you've tired about hearing it. So I want to give you a different perspective to talk about, which is your internal fees. Internal fees, external fees. How do we look at internal fees? How do we affect internal fees? How do we change internal fees so that it is a bit of a more fair system, so that liquidity providers are not constantly suffering impermanent loss? This thing is basically to make up for impermanent loss, period. So that's symmetric addition. Now let's move on to asymmetric addition. Okay, so let's get started with asymmetric addition. I'll use pictures again because that's very easy. Step 1, we have ROWAN tokens, we have Lisa tokens. Step 2, somebody wants to add additional ROWAN tokens inside. Well, that's basically it. What does asymmetric mean, right? Asymmetric means that you're only adding one side. So how does the system deal with that? Firstly, do you remember when we talked about asymmetric addition? We talked about it in Bancor. So Bancor's version 2.1 talks about asymmetric addition when the protocol itself will be pairing up, will be adding the other side of liquidity. Now we go a step further to see how the asymmetric addition can be added into the liquidity pool and equalize the composition. Let's see. It's actually really easy in visually, I mean. So step 1 is to fully add the tokens inside. Okay, so remember we have the x times y equals k model. This works. If we do x times y, get k model, does not work because they are not proportional. So what do? Then we go to step 3. So it looks at, okay, it's not equal. What do we need to do to equalize it so that we get x times y, you get k again? So it basically sees this ROWAN token, and then it takes away this part using the liquidity in the pool itself to trade it for Lisa tokens so that it's balanced again. So it is, once again, it's the same thing. ROWAN tokens and Lisa tokens inside, and then you also have proportional ROWAN token and Lisa token inside. The key difference is that the system itself will rebalance the one-sided liquidity you add in so that it balances out. That's it. So we talked about liquidity providers. We talked about the fees chargeable to liquidity providers. In this scenario, it's quite interesting because number one, you have to pay a fee. You have to pay a fee to do this ROWAN to Lisa token exchange. At the same time, because if you already are a liquidity provider in the system, then you also earn fees when this happens because it gives to the liquidity pool. So it's a very interesting dynamic because you're adding and removing, you're paying and getting some subsidy almost back into the system. So it might be, it really depends, but it could be cheaper if you're just adding one side, and because you can potentially get to earn as well. So, and okay, in general, this is the idea. I'll just do one last very, very simple math thing to show you how it works, so it will make more sense when you're reading the math stuff if you want to go into that stuff. So this is the change in quantity of ROWAN. So it's the change in ROWAN swap plus change in ROWAN X dust. Okay, so this will be the last small part. The change in ROWAN token, so that means this is your, your addition. This black stuff, this black box. So this black box will be divided into add. Add is this one, and swap. So swap is this red thing, add is this black thing. And so when you're adding it into the system both the smart contract, it's all defined by math, will decide how much is swap, how much is add. So how much is the add here, how much is the swap here, plus some error term. So dust is usually an error term. And this error term exists in a lot of mathematical models because we can't do everything perfectly. Sometimes there's some bits and bobs here and there. And so we put the error term inside. And that's it. That's it for the ecosystem. So let's take a deeper dive into the economics of that, the design of the ROWAN token. So now we're back talking about the economics of the Sifchain's token, which is the ROWAN token. And I just want to emphasize some points that I've already talked about on the whiteboard. When we look at market design, one of the main important things before we even design tokens, the tokens have to be used by someone. There must be a reason that the tokens exist for. It could be a rules kind of game where the tokens exist for, but people have to use it. There must be someone using the tokens. And so we have to start off with actors and participants, because at the end of the day, tokens are just a medium to incentivize people to behave in the way you want them to behave. So who are these people we're talking about? When we go back and when we do a recap of what we talked about just now, the first thing is validators. So these validators will be like your Bitcoin miners, your liquidity providers, or your validators, your liquidity providers, as well as your traders or people who just exchange tokens. So these are the three main actors. And the two actors that we want to focus on is the validators and liquidity providers, because this is where we can use the tokens to affect them the most in how they decide to allocate, or where do they decide to allocate the tokens. They could allocate it to the validators pool to become a validator, or they can allocate it to the liquidity pool to become a liquidity provider. And it really depends on the rewards that's given to them. So in the validator segment, firstly, the block rewards are determined dynamically, as we have seen, we went through just now. It depends on how many blocks depends on the blocks minted, and it depends on the number of validators in the system. It depends on the kind of inflation that we're talking about. It depends on the comparison between the actual number of validators we have in the system versus the ideal number of validators we want, which is 66%, so 2/3. And on the liquidity provider side, it depends on the fees earned as well as the token rewards. So in Sifchain, the first 12 weeks that they roll out, and they're planning to roll out in mid-Jan, they're going to do a 12 weeks subsidy, which is what you probably call yield farming or liquidity mining, where the system, the protocol, will also subsidize some rewards given to the liquidity providers. It's quite similar to it's basically quite similar to a lot of these yield farming liquidity mining systems that's out there, just that it's not long term, it's very specific to 12 weeks. So let's look at the ROWAN token design itself. So the few factors affecting the ROWAN token. First one is the percentage stake by validators. As I mentioned, there is the validator stake, the ideal versus the actual stake. So that will be one of the main key difference. The second is the stake by liquidity providers, because of the 1/3 that's not staked by validators, then people will either use it, trade it, or become a liquidity provider. And so you want to balance that as well. Then you want to balance the rewards between liquidity providers and validators, because there'll be rewards given to them. And if one of them is too much, people will all flock to the other side, and the system will not be so robust. Remember, if too many people become liquidity providers, there isn't enough validators, transaction fees will be very expensive, people could exploit the system. This is where you could have your 51% attack. If there's too many people being validators, then there isn't enough liquidity providers, there isn't enough transactions that's going on, And that would be a bit silly to be validator because there's nothing to validate. So that's the other problem. So how do you balance both of them? Then you also have your minting schedule to the validators, which is your minting and burning structure. In general, the way to reduce the amount of, there's a fixed supply, and the way to reduce the amount of tokens is through burning. And burning is when a validator is a bad actor. Or it can be more people staking, so you have less circulating around. And then otherwise, it's just the minting reward schedule, the block rewards. And lastly, it's your LP tokens, your LP rewards. So that, as I mentioned, is a 12-week subsidy program that ROWAN, the Sifchain will get started with. And one of the things that you realize that I keep talking about in this entire whiteboard session is rebalancing. We have rebalancing seen in two main ways. The first one is where you are balancing the rewards between validators and liquidity providers so that you have a correct amount of people in or correct amount of participation in both systems. On the other hand, we also have rebalancing in the liquidity pool because you can have asymmetric addition to the liquidity pool, and the liquidity pool will balance itself out to make sure that it is the same amount again. And so, yeah, there are a few things to balance to make sure that the system is robust on its own, as well as dynamically taking in a lot of variables so that it constantly rebalances itself. That's about it for the project. Sifchain will probably start, the scheduled day of launch is in mid-January. And I think this system is quite interesting. Oh, it's very interesting because it adds a new dimension, a new layer to such systems. One of the problems with all these different systems built on this Ethereum blockchain is that transactions get very expensive. Yes, it's true that a lot of ERC20 tokens can be traded and there's more demand to it, but it can also be very expensive when so many users are trying to make transactions. So you have other systems like on Thorchain, on other layer 1 blockchain, but they don't exactly interact with ERC20 tokens, which is where most of your demand and trade will come from anyway. So Sifchain resolves that by building by having both the validators to validate your transactions and also the liquidity providers that's in existence on their system. So think of it like a layer 2 solution building their own DEX application in the layer 2. It's a very similar concept. So other layer 2 protocols will be like Near. I don't know if Silica is considered layer 2, but they use sharding in their layer 1 in their system to make it faster, make it cheaper. And you have a lot of other, ZK rollup mechanisms. So right now, one of the problems in layer 2 solutions, which I've talked about in the previous episode, is that it is still quite fixed. A lot of layer 2 solutions, they're not as, it also depends if you're talking about side chains or child chains, right? They're quite limited in the amount of applications complex applications that they can run and they can host. And so I thought Sifchain might be a very interesting example that I could share with you guys, where it doesn't have that kind of problems that you have in child chains and side chains, at least right now, which is the whole data side of things. And right now, it's just looking at validators, validating transactions, and the application, instead of being a P2P currency like Bitcoin, it really focuses on P2P exchange in decentralized exchanges. So that is it for this week's episode. I hope that makes a lot more sense. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the math, but I realized that a lot of the step-by-step things are already out there. And I've already talked about the math side of AMMs quite a few times. So I really don't want to be repeating myself. I don't want to be wasting your time. So I wanted to go into the general understanding as well as the different mechanisms and considerations to look at when you're designing the system, especially rebalancing, which is a very key component when you're balancing out the economics of the entire system and the entire 2 subsystem, which is the validators and liquidity providers. So that's all for this week. I really hope you enjoy it. The Token Economics book is also out. If you're interested, you can just go to book.economicsdesign.com. The ebook version is coming out in a couple of weeks. I'm just getting it redesigned so that you could highlight, you can add notes, you can read it in dark mode, and you can have more hyperlinks in between the chapters. Till then, I'll see you next week. Bye!